Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to the Rantin Review Pro Wrestling. Yes, we are back here talking about the world of pro wrestling and sports entertainment on the channel. I appreciate you guys watching this online. And if you are a Patreon, you are getting the full-on podcast version of this. So I definitely appreciate you guys checking this out for my patrons. But let's get into some of the big things that have happened this week in wrestling. I want to start out with the Independence Day show that happened for NJPW Strong on July 4th and July 5th. There was a lot of things that came out of that show. The first night, I went into that and I saw it like a day after the shows had aired. And I went into it not really kind of feeling it because and I need to stop doing that. It's an NJPW Strong show. So it's like, well, it's not NJPW proper. And for those of you who don't know, NJPW Strong is to New Japan what NXT is to WWE, what Ring of Honor is to AEW. I have to say this year, NJPW Strong has probably put out some of the best shows of any company this year. And this Independence Day thing, it's its own unique kind of weird world. And the first night on July 4th was a fantastic night. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but among the highlights of this show, Eddie Kingston making his New Japan Pro Wrestling debut, going to Cork and Hall. You could see the emotion on his face. He teamed up the first night with Rocky Romero to take on Gedo and Kenta. And then, of course, as was reported on AEW Dynamite Wednesday, he did face Kenta for the NJPW Strong Never Openweight Championship. He did win that championship, winning his first official New Japan Championship. Eddie Kingston was so full of emotion. If for anything, just for that, you should watch that show. And I know it's a pay-per-view, but it's not too expensive, but you can probably check it out. I definitely would. There was a lot of other people on the show from a lot of different promotions, not just New Japan and NJPW Strong. You had ladies from Stardom. You had people from some of the indie, Japanese, the actual indie, because New Japan's not an indie. Sorry for MJF and all the WWE sweaties. New Japan Pro Wrestling's been around longer than all of you. It's not an indie. It never has been an indie, never will be an indie. But the actual Japanese indie promotions had some of their wrestlers on the show. Some weird guy with a cat. There's a lot of people I had not seen before. I finally got to see Julia, who I've been hearing so much about, and I don't watch anywhere near as much wrestling as I used to a couple years ago, and I've heard so much about Julia, and I did get to see Julia on the show, so I was really hyped for that one. And seeing her against Willow Nightingale from AEW, of course, she's the NJPW Strong Champion, so she's crossing 3 promotions here. She made a great impression there, but I think 2 big major things outside of the Eddie Kingston thing stood out to me. Number one, I know a lot of people are giving the current New Japan Bullet Club kind of a feeling, especially given the fact that in AEW right now, Jay White and Juice Robinson and the Golden Guns, I guess they're calling them now, the Bang Bang Gang, are doing a bang-up job on AEW Collision right now, and Juice Robinson is a national treasure.
Oh, Punk! No! Why? Why do you want me to go to sleep so bad, huh? Why do you want me to go to sleep? I'm not tired. I'm fully rested. I got my 8 hours. You see bags under my eyes, boy?
But back in New Japan with David Finlay, a lot of us have been kind of lukewarm to it, and I was going to say, on this Independence Day show, this is another reason you might want to check it out. All of the dojo guys, the LA dojo guys, all of basically Shibata's guys, the War Dogs essentially, Finley's charges of these young, aggressive Western wrestlers. Oh my God, these are some... I think the tone of this new Bullet Club is vicious, and they've really set themselves apart from prior Bullet Clubs, where, even the original Bullet Club with Devitt and Fale and Carl Anderson and Tama Tonga and Luke Gallows was not as vicious as this group is. The AJ group was more of a kind of like a TNA Aces and Eights kind of version of Bullet Club. Of course, then we had the Elite version of Bullet Club. Jay White's version of Bullet Club was really more about him than the club. This version of Bullet Club, War Dogs, both sets of the tag teams for Bullet Club of these former Young Lions have all taken the tag titles in New Japan. TJP, which is a match you definitely need to check out. TJP and Akira Francesca Francesco catch 2-2, and that match that they had against Clark Connors and Maloney, that is a fantastic junior tag team match. And I've said it for the last year or so, catch 2-2 is one of the best tag teams, and they are an unsung tag team, and they probably will wind up on my tag teams of the year list. They are not getting the credit they deserve. And what I saw from Maloney and from Clark Connors, these two guys who beat the living crap out of each other in the Best of the Super Juniors tournament are now beating the crap out of the juniors tag division, even though neither one of those guys really looks like juniors to me. But that was a fantastic tag match. I want to see a rematch with those guys. And then, oh my God, poor Bishamon. They faced the War Dogs, and even you got Rick Avani on commentary, because Kevin Kelly wasn't doing the commentary with Chris Charlton on the show. He's commenting about how different these wrestlers are. Alex Coughlin and Gabriel Kidd are absolutely vicious. They're not only vicious, they're disrespectful as hell. They're throwing they're going into the crowd. People are getting moved out of their chairs. They're throwing the chairs everywhere. They're spitting and throwing things into the crowd. They even almost knocked over one of the presidents of one of the sponsors for the shows, which actually Moxley later in the show actually did knock the guy out of his chair, but not on purpose. But these guys are just, and they're just belligerent and violent and rude, and they get on a microphone and basically they just curse and say F you. Now, I know a lot of you guys haven't checked out the new Bullet Club and a little bit lukewarm on David Finley's Bullet Club, the Rebel Club, or the War Dogs. I'm thinking after seeing these two shows, this might work. This new Bullet Club might work. They are cranking it up to 1,000 with the aggression from these four young guys, and it paid dividends. They have the tag team championships across multiple divisions and multiple brands in New Japan right now. So that is absolutely something that I want to keep an eye on. And again, if you go watch the show, those two tag matches, Bishamon versus the War Dogs and TJP and Francesco Akira, Catch 2-2, going up against Clark Connors and Maloney, I think those were two of the best matches and some hard-hitting matches. And the Japanese crowd was absolutely loving this. And what they really, really loved, which I think possibly might mark a change in direction once again for New Japan. Because New Japan does not do a lot of hardcore wrestling in recent years. Now, if you go back in the day, New Japan did a lot. There was a lot of hardcore bloody matches in New Japan. Hasn't been the style for, I'd say, at least 15 years now. Maybe going about that long in New Japan. It might be a little shorter than that. But they don't do a lot of bloody matches, not a lot of cage matches, not a lot of hardcore matches. Del Desperado's teaming up with Jun Kasai to take on Jon Moxley and Homicide. And when I originally saw that match, I was like, oh my God. You have four of some of the most violent people in wrestling. I mean, that's not an exaggeration. Four of the most violent people in current modern wrestling. In fact, over wrestling for the past 20 years, to be honest with you, in a no-holds-barred death tag team match. And then on the next night, Moxley and Desperado are going to be in their own death match. There's like, look, you need to really, if you're squeamish, I would not suggest watching this match because it is everything that you expect. It is razor blades. It is trash, the usual trash cans and stuff. It is beds made of forks. It is people gouging each other, putting skewers in their heads. It's insane. It's bloody. It's graphic. It's cringy. I watched half of the match going like this, but for me, I love it. It's absolutely fantastic. Both of those matches on both nights, even the singles match of Moxley and Desperado was fantastic. The tag match before was, and there's something that was interesting that came about this. The New Japan crowd at Korakuen Hall absolutely ate this stuff up. They ate it up, and even Desperado and Kasai said, look, this isn't what the King of Sports does, is it? Well, maybe it will be. And I wonder, are we going to see maybe a little more openness to these kind of matches in New Japan going forward? I think it's possible. And again, this is not out of the wheelhouse for the history of New Japan Pro Wrestling. Since Bushiroad's owned the company, they've really kind of shied away from this kind of stuff. But with the response from the crowd and the response online for it, we might be seeing, again, a little change in the future of New Japan Pro Wrestling. What hasn't been going over very well in New Japan right now is the dawning of the name, the Reiwa Three Musketeers for the young wrestlers, the young upstarts of this year, Shota Umino, Ren Narita, and Yota Tsuji. That was now the Three Musketeers. For those of you who aren't familiar with New Japan Pro Wrestling, historically that's been given to a lot of different groups of wrestlers. There's always kind of that three. You've had Chono, Shinya Hashimoto, and those guys at their time. More recently, Shinsuke Nakamura, Hiroshi Tanahashi, and Katsuyori Shibata were considered the Three Musketeers of their time, which I think is why that name is and that moniker is being given to these three new young guys coming up there, because again, Ren Narita is very much in the mold of Shibata. Shota Umino does have a lot of that remind you of Hiroshi Tanahashi. However, it seems like the fans have not taken to this name. A lot of the wrestlers backstage have not taken to this name. So I think you might see the end of that pretty soon. I don't even think Antonio Inoki would like this, but this brings up another story that happened this week. And apparently, Brock Lesnar told a story about how he kind of got pranked and wrestled a wrestling legend for 90 minutes and didn't know who he was. The wrestling legend was Antonio Inoki. So back when Lesnar was doing some of his Japanese wrestling, his run in Japanese wrestling, he did wrestle Inoki. He didn't know who Inoki was, and they just sparred for 90 minutes, trading counters and submissions and everything else. And Inoki, who was 60 at the time, was in great shape, and Lesnar seems like he was somewhat impressed that the 60-year-old man could hang with him as much as he could. And afterwards, Lesnar was informed that was Antonio Inoki and who Antonio Inoki was. And he said at the time it kind of struck him as weird, but he's now said that now he knows who Inoki is. He understands what a presence Antonio Inoki was, but at the time he didn't know who he was. Now, of course, there's some WWE fans who are going, as they always do, go, of course, nobody cares about what happens in Japan. Dude, if I hear one more... If I hear one more of these sweaties go on about this, Antonio Inoki, the late, great Antonio Inoki, he had the first really legitimate MMA match with Muhammad Ali. I mean, the guy, of course, pioneered New Japan Pro Wrestling, has drawn a lot more than I would say almost anybody else in wrestling as a promoter outside of Vince and maybe Baba or somebody like that. But Inoki is a legend. And yeah, Lesnar, who grew up in America, wasn't familiar with him. But this is a thing, an ongoing thing, and unfortunately the wrestling community, of this idea that only what happens in WWE matters and nothing else does. And we've said this 1,000 times. There is an entire wrestling world outside of just what happens in WWE. And this also brings up another kind of a fair point. A lot of wrestlers on social media will say, hey, I'm upset that I was in the business and fans aren't listening to me when they get stuff wrong. Just because you you were in the business, I don't care if you're Coach or Disco Inferno or whoever, doesn't mean that you know everything about the business. There's a lot of stuff that happens in a lot of different places and a lot of different times and eras that just because you were in the business doesn't mean you know. There are a lot of things that people who are in the movie business don't know about, the history of motion pictures. So, and that's in every single genre. So, but at least Lesnar here, humble enough and smart enough to realize, he's like, oh yeah, well, I was a young guy, I didn't know what I was talking about, and I didn't know who I was wrestling, and then it was a prank. So that was an interesting tidbit about Brock Lesnar. Speaking of Brock, however, and wrestlers like him, who I guess you can consider Brock a celebrity wrestler in WWE, Logan Paul recently on his Impulsive podcast talked about that crazy bump he took at Money in the Bank, where he did, I think it was a frog splash off the top rope to the outside on a Damian Priest who was laying across the ladder. And when you watch it, like, Paul literally bounces off of the daggone ladder, and Damian Priest looked like it sucked for him, looked like it sucked to take for Damian Priest. The ladder was fine though. As JR would say, flesh and steel always wins. But Logan Paul went on his podcast and he essentially said this about what the wrestling fans said about him.
Fans go so hard in the city. They have no respect for what I do. I'm sacrificing my body out there. I jumped onto Damian Priest onto a ladder, frog splashed him, and bounced off this human like a trampoline. Like, I felt his rib cage crush under the weight of my 60-inch box jump. and they started chanting, "You still suck, you still suck."
I swear to God, every time one of them started, Jeff joined in.
Now, in all reality, that's Paul probably, Logan Paul understands the wrestling business very well. He understands being an entertainer, which WWE is, as we all know, heavily on the entertainment side of sports entertainment. And he said this on Impulsive, and maybe there was a little bit of a shoot in this, but it's also part of a work, and I don't think he meant anything harmful by it. But it did bring up a lot of wrestling fans who were in the comments writing all kinds of crazy stuff about it. This other person said, "Dude, nobody cares what you say or do. It's just you're still effing annoying as F." These comments bring up two things. Number one, it's kind of cool to see that at least half of the people in the comment section get it. They understand that, Logan Paul's a celebrity. He brings eyeballs to WWE, and it also helps him enhance his profile as a social media star. But the last guy is like, nobody cares about what you... I love it when somebody who themselves has, 20... This person has like 20 followers, says to somebody with tens of millions of followers that nobody cares about what he's doing. This also brings up a very funny, ironic thing that I have talked about over the last week, is that I do also find it with WWE sweaties. Remember, there's a difference between WWE sweaties and WWE fans. The sweaties are the annoying trolls. And it's really funny with the WWE sweaties how they knock people like Logan Paul, like Brock Lesnar, like Ronda Rousey, like Bad Bunny for not paying their dues in wrestling. And it doesn't matter what they did elsewhere in the mainstream. It doesn't matter that Bad Bunny's a big star, or Logan Paul's a big star, or Brock Lesnar was a big star. It is these very same people who also knock the entirety of the rest of the wrestling world that's not WWE for their stars not being big enough stars. You literally can't write something that ironically tone deaf. It's only the sweaties. They tend to be a lot of them, and they tend to be loud, but at least half of the people understand what this all is, especially with the way WWE is now and what WWE is, which is a giant media conglomerate thing now under the Endeavor umbrella. And if you don't like seeing guest people in the wrestling ring, wrestling matches, and they're taking spots away from other people who've paid their dues, except for the fact when they paid their dues in the other places they wrestled at, you didn't bother to watch them because they weren't big enough stars for you to care about them then. Get used to it, because with Endeavor and for some of the rumors that are going around, there's going to be a lot more of this kind of stuff happening in WWE in the future. So keep that in mind. Back to someone I talked about earlier, Jon Moxley apparently had an entire dissertation as to why he likes blood in wrestling, and he thinks that wrestling should have blood in it. And it goes a little, this is just a little part of it. You can follow the link in the description box below to see most of the rest of this. But so what he says is, to quote, "This is combat sport," says Moxley. "College wrestling is a combat sport too. They have blood timeouts to patch it up. The lowest prelim bout of a UFC card or a boxing card, somebody might have a little blood on their eyebrow or blood coming out of their nose. But they're not selling a blood sport. It's not. Tune in for the blood. Tune in for the gore. It's part of the aesthetic. It adds realism." A much shorter answer, Moxley explained, is that he has so much scar tissue on his eyebrows and head that he cuts very easily. "Sometimes when I don't even want to," says Moxley, "but I only know one speed. That's with my foot onto the gas pedal. If we're going to do something, let's effing do it. That can be detrimental when it comes to negative things like drugs or alcohol, but that's my mindset. If I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it." Moxley, yes, that is Moxley's mindset. We all know of the issues that he's had in the past. But this is, I think there's a bit of legitimacy to what he's saying. The two things, and the commentators in AEW brought this up, Moxley's done so much blading at this point over the last 3 or 4 years that the scar tissue on his head, even when he doesn't intend to bleed, he's got so much scar tissue over here and over here and over here that he just bleeds anyway. That's what happens when you have a lot of scar tissue, apparently. But I do agree with his thing about that in combat sports, there's going to be blood. And that a little bit of blood here and there can add to the realism, or at least the feeling of realism, the presentation of pro wrestling. It's always been that way. I grew up in the 80s, so I saw tons, especially watching Crockett and the NWA. I saw tons. I saw Dusty bleeding all the time. I've seen Abdullah the Butcher shove forks into people's heads. I've seen all kinds of stuff. Of course, those of us who were in the Attitude Era, if WWF, you saw tons of blood during the Attitude Era. It's nothing new to wrestling. It's always going to be a part of wrestling. Companies decide whether or not they're going to use it. I just mentioned before, New Japan's been has steered away from that stuff over the last 10, 15 years. But that death match that they had, you might see a little bit more of it in New Japan now. I will say this, I do think Moxley does overdo it, but according to this, again, I don't think he intends to overdo it, but I do think there definitely was a period about 6 to 8 months ago when it was a bit excessive in AEW with the blood. I noticed they've toned it down a lot over the last 6 months because AEW does listen to its fans. Doesn't mean that they haven't had any blood, because we've seen blood on most of their pay-per-views, but it's not like every single week we have 3 or 4 matches. There was a period of time where it felt like every week on Dynamite you'd have at least 2 matches with somebody bleeding. But I understand Moxley's point here. Now, whether or not you agree with it, let me know in the comment box below. Let your voice be heard. One last little note, following AEW Dynamite this past week, I will say it was one of the more sports entertaining versions of AEW Dynamite that they have had since the show has been on the air. I do kind of go back and forth on whether that's a good thing or not. I think every once in a while, though, for them to have an episode of Dynamite that is way more sports entertainment based, as opposed to them having solid wrestling matches and angles being shot, and it's more kind of skits kind of things, I think that's fine every once in a while. But yeah, AEW has definitely turned more sports entertaining over the last year or so, but this case, it was a very good thing. The whole buddy cop thing, or odd couple thing with MJF and Adam Cole, I was not wild about it when I first saw that's what they were going to do. Can they coexist? They're going to be a tag team, yada yada yada. But MJF and Adam Cole absolutely knocked this thing out of the park. The little segment they had about lifting weights plays into a lot of what's being talked about with Adam Cole, and he's a very skinny guy, and you know, other wrestlers, Booker T in particular, mocking him for his size and stuff. And then they had this whole segment where Adam Cole was pushing more the same weight that MJF was pushing, and MJF's been getting into bodybuilding and really has transformed his body over the last year. And they had that little joke thing where Adam Cole's just pumping as much weight as he has, and MJF's like, what the, that was fantastic. That was funny. The whole match that they had on the show, and MJF, you cannot take away that this guy is just hands down a fantastic sports entertainer, and he's also a great wrestler. He's got both sides of the wrestling business just under his belt. He knows what to do. He knows how to do it. Yes, we all know at some point in time in the future, he is a WWE type of wrestler. He will probably be there at some point in time in the future. But for now, I just want to enjoy MJF being able, because when he goes to WWE, a lot of the stuff we've seen him do in AEW that's entertaining, he ain't gonna be able to do in WWE, especially with them being even bigger, a bigger corporation now with a lot to answer for. So we might not see him do that there, but while he's in AEW, we can enjoy all of this stuff, and there's tons more for MJF to do, along with Adam Cole, Baby, or I'm better than you, Baby, and you know it, and all this stuff. They just, that's great stuff.
You know who he reminds me of?
Tony Schiavone!
Oh God, he's so gross.
I love the fact that the tournaments are continuing. They've got 2 tournaments going on at the same time. This tag team wild card eliminator tournament, which is basically WCW's old Battle Bowl format. And we've also got the Owen Hart male and female tournament. So technically that's 3 tournaments going on at the same time in AEW. And I think it can be a little confusing having that much going on. But I've always said tournaments give a reason for matches to happen, and much like this is kind of the way New Japan books. New Japan has a lot of tournaments, and when you have those matchups in the tournaments, out of that spin storylines and feuds, and I think we're going to see that here. I love the fact that they brought back Swerve Strickland and Keith Lee as they teamed up to take on Orange Cassidy and Darby Allin, and kind of continued this never concluded rivalry between Keith Lee and Swerve Strickland. I don't know if we're ever going to get the one-on-one match between the two of them, but I think that's interesting. AEW does drop feuds sometimes. Chris Jericho and Don Callis now may be forming an alliance. It feels like the JAS is on its way out. I think it's about time too for the JAS to kind of end. I think it's done as much as it can do. And Jericho did even say to Sammy Guevara and Daniel Garcia, you guys gonna have to go out and do it on your own now. And they will be teaming up together in the tournament going forward. So there's a lot of moving parts here. Some things are shifting around. I don't know where this Jericho... I wonder if Jericho is going to be taking the place of Bryan Danielson, since Danielson legitimately has a injured arm in the Blood and Guts match that's coming up. I believe it's next week or the week after next week. And of course, the big watch is out for Kota Ibushi. We're still on Kota Ibushi watch. Kota Ibushi is turning into the Thanos of AEW. It's in the sense that if you remember in the MCU, like Thanos... Everybody, all the hardcore fans and the people that read the comics and the people who had the intellectual curiosity to look up Marvel stuff knew who Thanos was and that Thanos was coming and it was a big deal. It's kind of the same thing, but the casuals didn't know who he was, and then he showed up and it was a thing. It's kind of the same thing here with Kota Ibushi. Like, the hardcore fans, the fans like myself who've watched, New Japan and know the history between Kota Ibushi and Kenny Omega are like, oh my God, Kota Ibushi's coming, Kota Ibushi's coming, Kota Ibushi's coming. And I think the other half of the AEW fan base has heard of this. They don't know who Kota Ibushi is. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But that's what it's turned into. We are on watch for Kota Ibushi. They have announced the Blood and Guts match. They also have made mention, which they should have, as I talked about on Twitter, that Eddie Kingston is not going to be in the Blood and Guts match because he's in Japan. He's going to be in New Japan in the G1 tournament for the next month. Danielson being injured, there are 2 blank spots for the Elite and for the Blackpool Combat Club and Takeshita for who's going to be under the 5th man in those Blood and Guts matches. Is Jericho going to be the 5th man for the Combat Club and Don Callis? And is Kota Ibushi going to be the 3rd man for the Elite? I think the Kota Ibushi one, I'm about 50%. I think it's about a 50% chance that it's going to be him. I really don't know about who's taking the place of Danielson in the Blackpool Combat Club for the Blood and Guts match. It could be a number of different people, and a lot of fans have talked about Chris Hero. Fans have talked about them bringing in other people from outside of AEW, maybe somebody from Mexico. Now, they could do a thing where they wait to the night of, where all the guys from the team come in, and then there's a big question, who's the 5th man for each team? That will give some excitement to the Blood and Guts match. Maybe they're going to do it that way, but I expect that if they don't have some major league person, somebody that at least half of the audience is going to know when they come out, that they're not going to make it a big surprise on the day of. It'll be something they'll announce on Dynamite and Collision heading into Blood and Guts coming up pretty soon. So we're going to head into this weekend. We got Collision coming up this weekend, the big match with CM Punk and Samoa Joe in the Owen Hart tournament. Is Joe going to make it a 4 sweep over CM Punk, or is CM Punk finally going to get his win over Samoa Joe? Tell him when he's telling lies. And in WWE, we've got the Tribal Council. Expecting to see Alpha and Sika from my childhood. They scared the crap out of me when I was a kid watching WWF back in the 80s. Expecting to see them on SmackDown this coming Friday as the Bloodline storyline continues to churn on over in WWE. But I want to know what you guys thought about all of these stories. Let your voice be heard in the comment box below. And until next time, I will see you guys here for more news, rumors, and commentary on the Rant and Review Pro Wrestling. Have a good day.